Good afternoon. My name is Alick Simmons. Welcome to the third session of our fourth Wild Animal Welfare Committee conference. Following on from this morning where we discussed some practical aspects, this particular session is very much more oriented towards the assessments and how this has impacted on wildlife management. And we have 6 talks this afternoon. 2 of them are somewhat longer and then 4 short ones. So the first 2 by Adam Grogan and Nick Collinson will allow for a few questions at the end, but the remaining 4, the 4 that will run to the end of the session, will only have questions at the panel discussion, which will follow on from the end of the 6 talks. I've been asked to remind you, or at least let you know, that we've now got the first session recording online, and we expect that the rest of them will follow sequentially between now and the end of the day. So I think before we I do any further, we could probably move straight on to the first talk. I'd like to welcome Adam Grogan of UC Davis, who will be talking about advances in approaches to wildlife management. So Adam, welcome and thank you. Please start.
Good afternoon to you all. My name is Adam Grogan and I used to work for the RSPCA in the UK, but now I work for the One Health Institute based at the University of California on Old Wildlife Response. I would like to thank Pete Goddard and all at the Wild Animal Welfare Committee for asking me to talk about the outputs of a workshop that I attended at the University of British Columbia in 2015 and whether the outputs from that workshop, a report and a paper that defined the 7 international consensus principles, have led to advances in approaches to wildlife management, especially in terms of decision making and improving welfare outcomes for the wild animals under consideration. What I am presenting here today is a summary of what has occurred since that workshop and whether there have been any changes in wildlife management, practices or policy that can be attributed to its outcomes. Here you can see all the attendees of that workshop and my co-authors on the outputs that were produced. I would particularly like to acknowledge Sarah Dubois and David Fraser for the arranging of the meeting and driving the publication of the paper. In this presentation, I ask if the outputs of this workshop, a report and this paper have contributed to any changes in wildlife management policy. Have they had the impact those of us who contributed to the workshop and outputs would have wanted? However, let's start with an introduction to these principles in case some of you are not aware of them. These principles are built on work done over the past 20 years to develop processes to improve the decision making and management of wild animals where there are perceived conflicts with people and to improve the welfare of animals where some form of control has been agreed. On the screen you can see a summary of the principles. The need for these principles has been driven by an increasing awareness for the environment and animal welfare that has fueled public concern for how wild animals are managed. This, in turn, has driven various agencies to consider how the wildlife management decision-making process can be improved. Many animal protection organisations are aware that wildlife management programmes are often initiated because a particular species is seen as a threat, with decisions being made based on what has always been a traditional way of managing the problem, with no real justification for killing those animals and with no systematic approach to measure the success or a long-term management plan to ensure that the problems are not repeated. If you wish to hear a brief summary of the history behind these principles, then you can find a recording of a presentation I gave last year at the International Conference on Human-Wildlife Conflict, and I will make the link available to the organisers of this conference. So what are the 7 principles in detail? The first principle is to begin wherever possible by altering the human practices that cause human-wildlife conflict. A good example is to stop feeding wild animals that may be the cause of conflict and to better control our own garbage, especially when throwing away food. The next principle is that justification for control should be based on biological principles and evidence rather than on individual people's perceptions and estimates of overabundance. Comments like "there are just too many deer" are not helpful or indeed useful. Management must have clear and achievable outcome-based objectives that address the real problem to be solved and not the perceived problem. So the example of badgers in the UK being culled for bovine TB, many of the targets are measured in the numbers of badgers being culled rather than the levels of TB in cattle. Animal welfare must be prioritised regardless of the species under consideration. Many problem species are killed using methods that are not normally acceptable for other vertebrate animals, rather than trying to find alternative ways of managing the problem. So rodents like rats and mice and other animals like moles are often killed using methods that would just not be allowed for any other vertebrate animal. Decisions should be informed by community values as well as scientific, technical and practical information. What methods of control would be socially acceptable to the people around? And decisions regarding control must be part of a systematic and long-term management plan so that the mistakes aren't repeated and that the problem is addressed properly. And the last principle is that decisions should be based on the specifics of the situation rather than labels such as pest, vermin or invasive alien species. So in summary, these principles do not go against the killing of wild animals, but basically put forward a framework that states that it must be justified, it must be effective at resolving the problem, it must be humane, it must be part of a plan or strategy, and it must be subject to review. So these principles provide a decision-making process, a structure that helps decision makers to make decisions that are best for the situation, animal welfare, and that would result in demonstrable benefits. However, there are still challenges. Trying to change human behaviour is a major problem. Many do not understand that not only do we have to share our planet with many other species, but we may have to share our neighbourhoods too. It is often felt that wildlife belongs in the countryside and not in our backyards, without any consideration that the countryside is shrinking as urban areas, comprised of many backyards, continues to expand. Definition of humane is also an interesting example, where many may think humane means non-lethal, whereas some non-lethal methods, such as translocations, could have serious welfare implications. The authors of the principles also discussed other wildlife management issues during the meeting in 2015 and agreed that there are certain methods of control that are unacceptable, such as glue traps, conibeer traps, and various methods of killing such as carbon monoxide, mustard gas, bows and arrows, strychnine, and anticoagulants. The workshop resulted in a report that was produced by the British Columbia SPCA and University of British Columbia. Our real success was having a paper published in Conservation Biology in 2017. This moved our principles from grey literature to peer-reviewed published literature, which made the principles more widely available. But how widely available? How do we know if we have made a difference? Has the publication had any real effect in terms of what advances in wildlife management have there been since publication? Basically, how can we measure our impact? As a published paper, there are ways to obtain statistics of the numbers of times that a paper may have been read or cited in the literature, and as somebody trained in science, I initially looked for data to show how often the paper has been read or referred to. As a member of ResearchGate, I have access to statistics gathered on how widely the paper is read and cited by other ResearchGate users. In this table, you can see that of the 28 papers co-authored by me, this paper has a high research interest score and higher than average number of reads, citations and recommendations. ResearchGate can also give me data on how many times the paper has been cited in the years since publication. This graph shows that the number of citations drops over time, but the index score continues to rise. Other statistics are produced via the publisher's website. This screenshot shows the information that is available via Altmetric. This data is collated from various publications and it shows that consensus principle paper scores quite highly. The data from Altmetric tracking shows us, for example, that the paper was number 34 of 4,084 outputs from conservation biology and number 4 of 33 outputs published by Conservation Biology in 2017, and in the top 1% of research outputs published within 6 weeks of this paper's publication. But although the paper has been read, has it had an impact? So, as authors, we can be proud that our paper has certainly made it out into the world, but these statistics do not really tell us if the paper has affected the behaviour of those who have read it. Measuring this is much harder. For this, we are more reliant on what we have learned as we have tried to action these principles in our day-to-day work. Unsurprisingly, non-government organisations involved in the development of the consensus principles adopted them into their policies and used them for their advocacy work to argue for changes in legislation. Groups such as Born Free Foundation and the Wild Animal Welfare Committee had contributors to the paper and to the report, and of course they used them in their advocacy work. As head of wildlife in the RSPCA, I would use the principles frequently in consultation responses relating to wildlife management. Examples of this include consultation in England concerning management of deer and the Nature Recovery Green Paper. And in Wales, it was used in consultations regarding the use of snares and glue traps and grey squirrel management and shooting on public land. In Canada, the British Columbia SPCA developed Animal Kind, an accreditation scheme for animal-related business, including those defined as pest control. The scheme is based around the consensus principles. Other NGOs have been influenced by the consensus principles. The National Trust in the UK does not lobby to promote the principles, but it has adopted them. As a landowner with a large estate in the UK, it often has to deal with the conflicts between the many users of its estate and the wild animals that live there. The consensus principles are used to guide their actions to find resolutions to these issues, and they have had conversations with the RSPCA about how the principles can be applied. Other organisations do promote the consensus principles. Organisations such as the British Veterinary Association and Canadian Veterinary Medical Association reference the principles in their policies on wildlife management. Wildlife and Countryside Link, an umbrella body based in England representing over 80 conservation and welfare organisations, also promotes the principles in its consultation responses and advocates for them in other policy documents. So what effects have we seen in government and what changes in policy have we observed? Well, in BC, in Canada, the Sydney Island Ecological Restoration Project, which aims to restore the coastal Douglas fir ecosystem, required the management of fallow deer that were introduced to the island for hunting and farming. The decisions regarding the control of these animals is being carried out according to the consensus principles. Also in BC, second-generation anticoagulant rodenticides have been banned since July the 21st, 2021. In Wales, the government noted references to the consensus principles in their response to a consultation on the banning of glue traps and snares. The use of both glue traps and snares has now been banned in Wales. The principles have been discussed widely in Scotland, with the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission supporting the use of ethical principles, such as the consensus principles, where some form of wild animal management is required, and the principles were subsequently debated in the Scottish Parliament in May 2023. Furthermore, a paper was published in 2023 that reviewed whether the principles were aligned with Scottish law when the Hunting with Dogs Scotland Act was passed. This paper is an interesting discussion on the role that the principles may have played in determining the passing of the legislation, but I think that there is an interesting aside here, and that is, do these principles apply when the primary purpose for hunting wild animals is pleasure rather than necessity? This issue was also raised in a workshop I participated in to discuss the use of these principles in the management of deer in Scotland. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Kirsty Jenkins and Mike Daniels for facilitating this workshop as well. The workshop gave an opportunity to fit the principles into a working example. In Scotland, some landowners manage deer to mitigate the damage they cause on various habitats and biodiversity as a whole, while others are managed primarily for sport. During the discussions, it was felt that the principles worked or could be applied, and that many who were managing deer for conservation purposes followed some of the principles already. However, deer are managed differently where they are shot for sport, and although there may be damage caused by deer, prompting a need for them to be controlled, this is secondary to the primary reason of shooting for pleasure. So on estates where deer are shot for sport, they are often maintained at densities and or with a population structure that is not compatible with habitat protection or restoration. And of course, deer are no respecters of human boundaries, so will cross from one estate to another where the management objectives may be very different, with the result that some landowners struggle to achieve the objectives for habitat protection and restoration as deer migrate between estates, so creating conflicts between landowners. This is therefore a very different ethical basis for shooting. Deer are shot because people want to shoot them, not necessarily because deer need to be shot. This requires a very different change in human behaviour to reduce the desire or need to shoot deer for pleasure. Reducing or even removing the market for shooting deer for sport could result in a reduction in deer populations, and so improving the habitat restoration initiatives used by some landowners, and so improving the welfare for other species of animals that may struggle in areas where damage by deer is rife. So, to conclude, the paper published in Conservation Biology in 2017 has been widely read and cited in other publications. It has been adopted by many NGOs advocating for changing wildlife management regimes, and not just those that participated in the development of the principles. The principles have also been adopted by some government agencies, or at least mentioned by them in various publications they have produced. And there have been bans in anticoagulants and snares and glue traps in 2 regions. Can these be attributed to the publications of these principles? It's hard to know, as the bans may have been the result of momentum for change that has accumulated over the years. But we would certainly hope that the publication of the paper and the report with the principles has had some impact. I think it's still early days for the principles, and we will have to wait and see how much change they may promote in wildlife management. And there also needs to be awareness that there may be limitations to the principles. The one I have highlighted here, relating to the hunting of animals for sport, is one example, but others may apply. But I think the paper has had a good start, and I look forward to seeing how it may be used in the future to improve the welfare of animals that may be managed in the wild. Thank you very much.
Right, I think we can move on to a few questions now. We wanted to thank you, first of all, Adam, for a very stimulating talk. It's great to see that this piece of work is now, if you like, out in the wild and having some influence. And now we seem to have got 3 questions so far. We start with this first one. Given principle 1 of the 7 principles, how might evolve the human desire to control be integrated into this approach, such that we transform our relationship with nature at a more fundamental level. It's a nice philosophical one for you to start off with.
It's nice to have an easy start. Thank you very much, Alick, for the question. And thank you, Glenn, as well, for sending the question in. So part of my thinking here is basically we as human beings have to think about very much how we change our attitudes to nature. But a lot of that comes down to, we're talking as animal welfareists here. We need to bring in people who know how to communicate with human beings. And that may sound odd because we all communicate with human beings, but I listened to a presentation recently with the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council, who brought in this person to give this presentation on exactly that, communicating messages. And it is very much about telling a story. And I think we're often very bad at that. I think there's a lot of people who see wild animals. They might see them in their garden. A lot of time they like them, but they then perhaps struggle if they come into conflict. So there will be, when I was in the RSPCA, you would get people in the same neighborhood who like the foxes, but then they feed the foxes. And then of course their neighbors don't like the foxes because the foxes are making a mess, or they're afraid to let their children out because they think the foxes might bite the children. So we have to basically try and address this in storytelling mode, because I think that's what people listen to as stories. And how we deal with the living with, I think, is a big challenge, especially for some groups. So Alick, I know you know this one, and Glenn, it's a veterinary example that's a good veterinary example. In terms of bovine TB in the UK, how do you get the farming lobby to go to a risk-based living with the disease rather than a zero tolerance to the disease? They have had 100 years of a zero tolerance policy, and you need to try and change that if you want to say, argue with them that why badger culling is not effective. But that's a big game changer. That's a big change in their ideology and their culture. And how do you address that? As I say, I'm not a person who's an expert in communicating with people in those areas. We need people who know how to do that, to deliver these messages.
I think that's a really important point, because we can devise these clever and often very erudite approaches, a set of principles. But if they can't, if you like, speak to the whole raft of people with different views and different comprehensions, and perhaps even different sets of values, it becomes very, very difficult. So I'm very interested to hear what that person said. The communications expert. Perhaps you could talk about that at length at some other time. But I think probably we perhaps just see if we can get 1 or 2 more questions in. Samantha Oakes has asked, what does Link do when they adopted the principles? What have they done with it?
What of who? Sorry, which group are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about Link, but I realise that's an umbrella body of 80 odd organisations.
Yeah, so it was interesting for Mike to refer to Scottish Link, because in England, Wildlife Countryside Link was always set up with the welfare process. And I think that's because the RSPCA was involved with setting up a Wildlife Countryside Link in the beginning, but I know that's not reflected in the Welsh and Scottish links. So as a member of Link, the RSPCA would engage in the various groups. So as you know, Alick, there's an animal welfare group, but also I would sit on the invasive species group. I would sit on the bovine TB group, so we would engage with those groups and we would feed these policy documents in. Sometimes it is actually quite difficult. So the green paper I mentioned, the Nature Recovery green paper, it was very difficult to push with all the other groups to try and get agreement that there should be a general principle in the legislation that basically says all wild animals have some basic protection, which is more about their welfare. If you're going to put in legislation that, say, approves trapping, you need to have some basic legislation that says, however, all certainly sentient animals should have a basic protection, and that every every time you derogate that protection, you need to give a clear understanding of why and what the process is for getting, say, methods of killing removed from that. So, and that could be quite difficult because a lot of people just think, well, you're protecting everything doesn't work. But no, you can have some basic protections in there and just have lists that remove them, or statements in the legislation that just remove those protections if that's what you need to do.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'm conscious now that we ought to be moving on. I note there are another couple of questions in the question box, but see if I can squeeze those in when we have a wider discussion a bit later. And I'm very conscious that there's an appetite to find out how these organizations work. So actually the next talk we've got, and thank you very much, Adam, the next talk we've got is from Nick Collinson, who is a senior official with the National Trust. And trust me, I know what he's been doing, and will be talking in detail about turning these principles into practice.
Good afternoon. My name's Nick Collinson. I'm National Manager for Wildlife Management at the National Trust. And I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes just talking through our approach at the National Trust of turning principles into operational practice on the ground. I'm going to cover the National Trust, an introduction to the organisation, our approach to wildlife management, and how the 7 ethical principles, the international principles, dovetail into operational delivery on the ground, and what sort of policy systems and processes that we've set up to enable those principles to be translated into operational practice. I'll finish off with a case study on European mole, which perhaps you'll find of interest. So the National Trust was founded in 1895 and was soon reconstituted by a special act of Parliament, the National Trust Act in 1907. Largest charity, conservation charity in Europe, with 5.7 million members and very large numbers of staff and even more volunteers who are really essential in helping us to look after the places that we do. We own a very large area of land, the largest private landowner in the country, with 228,000 hectares of that 250,000 being inalienable, which means under the National Trust Act it can't be sold. We have lots of designations on National Trust land, which you'll see listed on the slide. All the way from really significant building designations to the sort of the highest designations for wildlife habitats and World Heritage sites. We also own 780 miles of coast. So the purposes of our incorporation in 1895, I've just set out some of the main pieces here. The use of the word permanent is obviously significant in terms of the National Trust Act and inalienability of our land. For the benefit of the nation is really important in terms of the sort of the everyone welcome agenda, and places of beauty and historic interest, and the preservation of their natural aspects, features, and animals and plant life are all really important. And we kind of summarise that now with looking after special places of historic interest and natural beauty for everyone, forever. I thought I'd just include this lovely statement from Octavia Hill, one of the founders of the National Trust, which feels as relevant now as perhaps it ever did in our tumultuous world. We all want quiet, we all want beauty, and we all need space. And without it, we don't have that sense of quiet in which whispers of better things come to us gently. I think that's wonderful. So what of wildlife management in terms of protecting and caring for the places that we do? So people and nature can thrive. Well, in the deportbrate ecosystems that we live in today, the lack of top predators it's quite normal that the management and lethal control of wildlife is sometimes required to achieve our charitable objectives, and to support nature recovery. And in some situations, of course, wildlife management is important to meet legal obligations. This can range from managing deer and squirrels in our woodlands and gardens, all the way through to rodents and wasps in our kitchens and cafes. And those are just 4 examples of situations that we're regularly supporting our property teams in terms of implementation and the sort of the translation of our principles and policies into the whys and the hows on the ground. And I'm sure this image on this slide will be familiar to all of you, but it's the absolute foundation of our approach to wildlife management in the National Trust. So these 7 ethical principles for ethical wildlife management kind of run through everything that we do. We're always thinking about how we can change and modify our practices before we need to intervene. And you know, simple examples of that are making sure our bins in our cafes are covered, so we don't have issues around rodents or wasps or squirrels. Planting more trees than we would perhaps seek to get away in a mature woodland, because we know that deer will browse away, so overplanting some of our new woodlands. So those are a couple of examples. So we're always thinking about modifying practice before we intervene. And where we do intervene, we need to justify it with evidence. So what are the impacts? What can we live with? And you know, what are the impacts that are really having a significant impact on our objectives? Ensuring the objectives, the whys and the what we're trying to achieve are really clear. Again, one of the things we talk about a lot to our property teams is being really clear on the why, the rationale. And prioritising animal welfare. Clearly, you know, we've got legal responsibility in terms of animal welfare. So prioritising the humaneness of what it is that we're doing is really important to us. Social acceptability too. As a member organisation with 5.7 million members, it's really important that we're clear on the why, and that has a clear line of sight to our charitable objectives. But also the how, and to ensuring that animal welfare is right up there. That social acceptability, I think, is just as important with our members and visitors, but also with our own staff and volunteer teams. So not all of our staff or volunteers, of course, are involved or necessarily understand, you know, some of the whys and wherefores of wildlife management. So, you know, making sure we're really clear on the whys and the whats and the hows. And thinking about that social acceptability is important. Obviously, conducting systematic planning is really important. Monitoring the efficacy of what we're doing. Do we need to adapt it? Do we need to change what we're doing? And clearly, you know, managing on the basis of you know, clear whys rather than just, you know, animals labels is important. And we're often having the conversations around not using the word pest or game or vermin, because of course it's all wildlife. So I put this slide up just to illustrate how the kind of the framework of some of our documents on this were, you know, sort of nest together. So our land policy, which really articulates how we manage our land, and then our wildlife management policy, which sits as a subset to that, are really important in just setting the corporate narrative around this area of work. So that sets the corporate narrative, and then we have our wildlife management instruction, which is a kind of a red line instructions, the must do's, the must not do's. And that then cascades into a whole series of guidance. So guidance on management of moles and squirrels and rabbits and wild deer and park deer, game shooting. You know, we've got a whole sort of library of guidance which sits beneath that wildlife management. But in all cases where we're lethally controlling vertebrates, we now mandate, you know, we mandate the need for a wildlife management plan to be in place. And that's where we articulate at a local level the whys, the hows, the how we're going to monitor the efficacy of what we're doing, you know, the objective that we're trying to achieve. So really important. And I think that wildlife management plan, not only important to articulate the whys and hows, but also just to you know, to have in place should we get questions about what we're doing. And it's really useful to have articulated and written down what it is that we're doing. And just finally, we work in a delegated model. While we have that corporate narrative through to the instructions, which are mandatory, then actually the guidance and if we change things operationally, we look at non-lethal, then we look at lethal. The decision to do that is a delegated decision, which sits with the property, which is why it's so important that we articulate that corporate narrative when we have this sort of nested series of instructions, policy instructions and guidance. So to talk just very briefly in terms of those nested sort of documents, we've got our policy position. This sits on what we call our rule book. So our policy position sets out the corporate narrative, talks about the need for management and sometimes lethal control to meet our charitable objectives, that we follow the 7 ethical principles of wildlife management, prioritizing methods that do the least harm to the fewest number of animals, and always following best practice to high standards of animal welfare. And of course, really important that we regularly review best practice, evidence, science, and benchmark our approach with others around us. And so we work in partnership a lot around many of these issues. Our instruction, which you'll remember I said was a kind of a mandatory red line instruction, it details the must-dos and the must-not-dos. Provides, what an instruction does for us as such a large organisation with so many properties and so much land, it gives us a consistency to a best practice approach. Thinking about a consistent thinking through the operational changes, the non-lethal, the lethal, the animal welfares, how that 7 ethical principles sort of dovetails into a wildlife management plan. So it obviously ensures that all our interventions are therefore evidence-based, ensures that we're compliant with legislation, and clearly therefore helps us manage risk, not just reputational risk, but also, of course, safety risk. As I've said, mandates that a wildlife management plan's in place. It sets out the accountability, who's accountable, who's responsible, and all that sort of stuff. And we've got a couple of annexes in the instruction, which our teams find really useful, which details the species for which we'll consider wildlife management, and the non-lethal and the lethal options that they are able to deploy. Particularly some of the lethal options they're not free to deploy, again around that humaneness and animal welfare piece. And then another annex on firearms calibers. So here's an example of one of the pages in the first annex around species. So this is for European mole and European rabbit, as you can see. It talks about the permitted rationales for intervention, some of the non-lethal methods, and certain lethal methods that may be deployed. I'll talk a little bit about mole in a minute, where our default is no lethal control at all. Yeah, so that's a useful guide for our teams. And the second annex actually just details, and this is a really useful table taken from BASC, the British Association for Shooting Conservation, and what this does is it articulates suitable calibers of firearm for particular species, and again really important from a welfare perspective that both our staff and contractors aren't using calibers of firearms that are unsuitable for the wildlife that we're managing. So in terms of the wildlife management plan itself, as I've said, this is mandated, and I'll talk about how we mandate that in a moment. But we've provided a template. I guess a lot of this isn't a surprise, but it's useful to sort of articulate how we've taken that policy at corporate narrative right down to operational delivery on the ground. So this will be completed by our teams on properties who are looking to undertake lethal control of vertebrates. So what are our property objectives, a description of the area in a map, what's the evidence, what the impacts that wildlife is having, what operational modifications have we already thought through, what non-lethal have we tried, and then the evidence base that lethal control is the right next step. How we're going to monitor but not only the impact, the ongoing impact, but how that impact changes, therefore the efficacy of the wildlife management undertaking. what sort of challenges there may be in terms of working with our neighbours. Things like grey squirrel and deer require sort of a landscape scale approach. So are those challenges? Have we got the resources in place? Is it a very busy property and therefore lots of visitors around? Making sure that we're keeping good records, and then as I say, ongoing, and wildlife management plans never set in stone. They're always sort of open working documents, an ongoing review of efficacy and is it working, and ensuring that this helps us have a really good comms plan in place about the whys. So rather than the 7 ethical principles diagram, which I showed earlier, we do use that, but this is actually just a wheel which articulates the same sort of thing that we have in our wildlife management plan template. So what's the purpose of your wildlife management? Have you collected evidence around impacts? What is stakeholder views, both locally, but also your own our own teams and volunteers? What control strategy are we going to use? What non-lethal have we tried, etc. We're taking a decision to implement, thinking about who's going to be accountable, who's going to be responsible, how we're going to measure, sort of monitor. Does our control strategy achieve the objectives that we want? And then obviously sort of that feeds back to, is it working? Are we achieving our objectives? And are we achieving the original purpose around the management itself? I think the last element in that sort of that nested set of documents is then a whole series of internal guidance, and this is just a quick image from our what we call our Acorn, our intranet. So we've got guidance, across a whole range of areas, which you can see in the grayed out boxes behind. And then our other guidance, which actually we've just modified again because we were always adding to it. That's where we've got specific things around grey squirrels. We've got some fantastic grey squirrel and mole case studies, which are kind of gathering property case studies, so we can share those with other properties. When a property hears that another property is having success with a particular measure, that's really helpful. So that's sort of that kind of peer support. Yeah, we have WASP guidance, for our food and beverage teams, often a big problem. Trapping guidance around spring trap approval orders, the whys and wherefores. We don't use snares, so just making sure that we've got good support around what our property teams are able to use, and we're continually adding to this. So we've very recently added guidance on marine mammal strandings, falconry, and the do's and don'ts in terms of falconry, releasing rehabilitated wildlife. So as our property teams are asking questions, then where we're getting asked questions on a regular basis, we're continuing to update that guidance, which, as I say, sits underneath the instructions and the policies. But I think a really important message, particularly sort of embedding this sort of stuff in a large institution like the National Trust, is it's more than just writing it down. It's constantly embedding this sort of corporate narrative. It's constantly embedding the question around the whys and the hows. We have a wildlife advisory group, and one of the Wild Animal Welfare Committee members sits on our wildlife advisory group. As I say, we've got our policy instructions, we've got central and regional consultancy advice. I regularly lead on webinars for our rangers, our gardens teams, or our state teams around wildlife management, new guidance that we're producing. We have workshops. We're focusing particularly at the moment around deer managers and deer management workshops, so bringing cohorts of staff together. Developing specific guidance, which I talked about, having exception process for things like mole control and use of falconry as a wildlife management tool. We have a compliance tracker, which we call Vantage, in which certain things have to be done and have to be ticked off in Vantage as a tracking system to ensure compliance. And of course, when we can, we get out and about and we support our properties with property visits. So a quick case study on moles, just to finish off. Clearly there's real concern around the humaneness of the spring claw traps commonly used for moles. We know that these traps aren't covered by the spring traps approval order, so the humaneness of some of these traps is highly questionable. And moles suffer from sort of being kind of their management being completely unregulated. And one can buy mole traps off the internet with no real guidance around how humane they are. And going back to this point about social acceptability in terms of wildlife management, moles is an area where we did get, quite heavily criticised back in 2017-18 around what then was quite widespread mole control in not just formal but also natural settings. So a kind of a real kind of welfare versus aesthetic kind of narrative. And as I've said, our default is now no lethal control, except for informal garden settings only, where we have an exception-only process, which has driven down lethal control about 80% across the organisation. We're starting to think about non-lethals more and more, and living with moles. And the number of properties now, right down to 40, only 14 across the whole organisation in 2023-24. But we do need more research in this area, I think, around the efficacy of non-lethal and lethal control. So to conclude, one of my sort of concluding thoughts around putting principles into practice, well, involve the expertise of others externally as well. Get your documentation sorted, get that nesting of sort of principles, policies, systems and processes in place. Be clear on who's accountable, crystal clear in terms of wildlife management on the why and the how. Create those operational plans, your wildlife management plans, keep things as simple as possible, adapt, learn, always adapting and learning, sharing that expertise, sharing the questions, networking with other organisations. And as I've said, advocate. In a large organisation like the National Trust, just having it written down isn't enough. Staff change, demands change, the external world changes, and the need for wildlife management changes too. Thanks for listening, and really happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's exactly what we wanted and exactly what I expected to get from you. So marvellous. And I'm sure you all agree that it's a really good example of very practical application of these principles. And I think the success in reducing the number of moles being killed on the estate by 8% is something to be applauded. Okay, I think we've really only got time for one question, but there's one that struck me as being just the most opposite in this context. What has been the thing or issue or decision that you found most challenging, the most challenging issue in implementing these principles in the National Trust?
Thanks, Alick, and thanks all. And I should actually say that Alex, the wildlife animal, the Wild Animal Welfare Committee member who sits on our Wildlife Advisory Group, and so thank you, Alick, for all that you do for the National Trust, I should say. I think probably the most challenging thing is actually the delegated model. So within the organisation, we have a delegated model. So decision making is made at property level by general managers. That's where the delegation sits. And so I think. For us, we've got our systems and processes in place, but actually the way that we work is, I kind of have to sort of give up control of this. If it was all my way, then it'd be, one particular way. But actually, we've got over 100 general managers, and so actually this is the really important thing about having our processes is sorted out, is that's where the consistency lies. But I think letting go of this into an organisation as diverse and different in different places as the National Trust, I think is been particularly difficult, but then supporting those properties to around that consistency piece is where we're really focused now.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we probably need to press on. We'll invite you back, Nick, to join the panel at the end, and one or two of the questions that popped up then I'm hoping that we'll have time to cover as well. But once again, thank you very much. I think that brings us to the next item. And as you know, there are 4 separate short talks here. The first of which is going to be given by Julie Lane, who's a senior official and scientist in the Animal and Plant Health Agency of DEFRA, and she'll be starting shortly.
Hi, I'm Julie Lane, and I'm going to be talking about the welfare aspects of lethal versus non-lethal population control in wildlife. Now, for me, the actual title is a little bit of a conflict because I always think of welfare at an individual level, which we have to do. That's how welfare works. But when we're thinking about population control as a whole, we have to balance the needs of the individual against that of the population. Now, when we're thinking of welfare, there's two main aspects, isn't there? There's the pain and distress that the animal is likely to feel or suffer, and there's also for how long that goes on, so the longevity. And in an ideal world, we'd have something that did cause very little pain or distress and didn't last very long, but sometimes we have to choose between one or the other. So when we think about lethal methods, we tend to want something that's of short longevity, because quite often lethal methods do cause a high level of pain or distress. So if we think about free shooting, that should be very quick. So we would consider that normally to be very humane. However, you're always going to get part of that population that's not shot cleanly. So you might get, I don't know, 90% of the animals die within seconds, but then you might have sort of 5 to 10% that crawl off into the woods and are never seen again. Now, they could be suffering not only for seconds, but minutes, hours, or even days or weeks. And so we need to balance whether that's appropriate, whether we use something like free shooting where we know the majority are going to die quickly, but there is always the potential for other animals to have a more painful death. So what we can do with lethal methods is use a method in which the animal is contained so that we know that the longevity of suffering can only be within that contained period. So if we look at spring traps, for example, these are kill traps, and in the UK we go by the Agreement on International Humane Trapping Standards, which states that animals must be rendered dead or irreversibly insensible within 300 seconds for most species or 45 seconds for stoats. But you'll notice it's only 80% of animals. So once again we have that dichotomy in the fact that you have the majority of animals dying relatively quickly, but there is a potential for the other 20% to die within any amount of time because there's no top level, there's no limit at the top. So obviously you can mitigate that by checking your traps and dispatching animals that are still alive. So moving on to lethal methods that take a bit longer, that have a higher longevity. In the UK, the main poison that is used in pest control are anticoagulants that are used on rodents. And we know that these take between 5 and 7 days to kill an animal. Now what we need to know really is how much is that actually causing the animal to suffer, because if it takes 7 days to die but it's only in pain for the last 10 minutes, then obviously that's a very different scenario. So we did some work a while back on this, and the graph shows the fecal corticosterone in the rats as an indicator of stress. The black line shows when the anticoagulant was administered, with the red line showing a high dose and the blue line showing a low dose of the anticoagulant. And that you can see it takes a few days to start causing significant impact, although the corticosterone does start to rise as soon as it's administered. But post 72 hours, so we've still got quite a few days, the level rises quite significantly in the higher dose. And I think we can safely say that the suffering of these animals is likely to be days rather than hours or minutes, and hence should really only be used in extreme circumstances when there's no other alternative. Now, obviously there are other lethal types of control that you can use that are quite quick. So, for example, more practical things like cranial concussion, breaking the neck or close-up shooting. But all of these require capture prior to being done. And I think we've got to be careful that we ensure that that is included in our welfare assessment, the welfare associated with the capture. So we did some work looking at stress relating to captivity. And this particular study shows some work we did on wild rats in cage traps. And it shows the amount of time that the rats spent trying to escape from the trap. And you can see that they spend more than half their time trying to get out. But what is surprising is that after 13 hours of captivity, they're still spending 2/3 of their time engaging in escape behaviour. So in essence, they're still spending the majority of the time trying to get out of the trap, which I think does indicate that this is a very stressful experience for them. In the same study, we also looked at fecal corticosteroid as a measure of stress, and you can clearly see from the graph that during their time in the cage trap, their corticosterone rose dramatically. But what is interesting is that post-trapping, so this is 24 hours after trapping, their levels have still not come back down to normal. So they are still feeling the after effects of the trap. So I think with these in combination with the behavioural work shows that catching an animal in a trap is a stressful experience and should always be counted when we're thinking about welfare aspects of any kind of control, be it lethal or non-lethal. So if we move to non-lethal methods, probably one of the most common methods used by members of the public is translocation. So if they don't want to kill the mouse in their house, they use one of these humane traps, they catch the animal and they move it down to a field. Now I say humane traps because that's what they're publicised as, but we know that translocation does have relatively high, or can have relatively high welfare impacts. Now there's been a wide-scale use of translocation for hedgehogs, taking them from some of the Scottish islands and moving them onto the mainland. And we do know that there is associated with that a relatively high mortality, which isn't surprising. You're moving an animal away from its home, it's got the stress of transport, it's got to find where the food is, where the water, harbourage, avoid predators, compete with conspecifics in the area. So although it's publicly acceptable, sometimes the welfare impacts of this are quite high and maybe higher than lethal control. So one of the best non-lethal methods is preventative action. Prevention is always better than cure. And so we did some work a while back looking at farms and just basically tidying them up, removing weeds, stopping spillage, and that has a significant impact on rat populations. And obviously you've got things like fencing and that kind of thing. But this only really applies at a local level. It's difficult to do fencing or tidying up on a more national level. And also we're not sure of the welfare implications. I mean, we think that we're not having any direct impact because we're not touching the animal, but we are removing its source of food and water. And so we don't know what the impact of that is likely to be. And there are other ways we can stop animals going into certain areas. We can use repellents such as ultrasonic repellents or things like bird scarers. These are quite good with respect to welfare, we think. Again, there's not a huge amount of work done on that, but they do tend to only work temporarily. So bird scarers in particular, the bird soon gets used to it and they're flocking back again. So it does mean that you constantly have to be upgrading and changing them. So one method of non-lethal control, which is for a long game, is fertility control. Now, this is currently available in injectable methods. So one of them, for example, is Gonacon, which is produced by the United States. And we've been using this to control a population of feral goats out in Wales. It works incredibly effectively. One injection lasts for approximately 4 years. And so it's not particularly labour intensive, but it does mean that the animal must be captured. And so for more wide-scale population control, we really do need an oral contraceptive. So that's what we're currently working on. We are developing an oral contraceptive primarily for grey squirrels, and we're hoping to be able to use this where culling is either illegal or undesirable, but also to complement culling as well. And I think that's the thing with most of these kinds of methods, both lethal and non-lethal, that they work best when in tandem, when used to complement each other. And I'd just like to finish to mention a couple of relatively novel approaches that are being taken on the grey squirrel in the UK. So there's some interest in using gene drives to genetically manipulate grey squirrels. So, for example, that they would only produce male offspring. Obviously, this may be quite controversial, and it's still very much in its infancy. We're looking at a good decade off there. So, but it'd be interesting to see what happens. And the other thing that has been trialled is actually biological control. So going back to old-fashioned methods of pest control. And the UK has been using pine martens as predators for grey squirrels. So bringing pine martens into areas where grey squirrels are rife. Obviously, with biological control brings its own issues, and we have to be very careful where we decide to release new medium-sized carnivores. But again, a very interesting development, and it'd be I'm keen to see how that one works. And on that note, I'd like to finish my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Julie. I hope you're available to join us a little later on. No doubt your interesting talk will have stimulated a few questions. We are, as you know, having to work to a pretty tight timetable. So we're now moving on to the next thing, and we'll see you in a few minutes. I'm going to invite James Yeates, who's Chief Executive of the World Federation for Animals and former Chief Vet with the RSPCA, to talk about the ethics of killing in a wild animal welfare context. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. I'm going to follow on from the last presentation, thinking a bit more about the ethics of killing, particularly in the context of wildlife, of course, and from an animal welfare perspective. And clearly death is a very emotive, sometimes divisive issue. It speaks to something fundamental in our angst and self-identity. On the one hand, it's also very natural. Every wild animal will die, but often we're talking about our own decisions and actions, direct and indirect. And often the debate is about whether animals should be killed. I think more practically it becomes a debate on when. When is it acceptable or even right to kill wildlife? And the first point to make is death does matter to wild animals. And I want to get rid of the idea that death's somehow irrelevant to those animals. Clearly the method matters because it can involve suffering, as we've heard. But also it's a loss of opportunity. Whatever extended, elongated life would have brought, that is no longer there for the animal. So whatever the philosophical complexities of animal welfare when you don't exist, you can compare those two lives. And it might be that the life that's lost is worth losing because it's one of suffering, but also it might be one where it's full of enjoyment or fulfillment. And that is, I think, independent of whether animals have their own explicit belief in their own identity and extension over time, or their own preferences over life and death. Without those, you can still have things that would be rewarding and beneficial from continued life. And the other way, we won't talk much today, but death is, of course, also sometimes a symptom of previous suffering for that animal. or sometimes a symptom of how humans engage with animals. A disregard for animal life sometimes is a symptom of essentially sort of disrespect for animals that also plays out in things that cause suffering. And of course, the welfare impacts are potentially enormous and complicated and emergent. So as well as the individual, other animals that the individual's life affects, be that dependent offspring, be that within food webs or habitat, where they're keeping the ecosystem maintained. Of course, the impact on population. Every animal death loses one of the population plus their progeny, but maybe that's compensated in other ways. Clearly, if they die, that might have impacts on health of those animals or others, and also affects ourselves as practitioners, the people making decisions on this. And perhaps it also affects perception, if you like, the opposite of the idea of the symptoms, that actually the more we disregard or pay undue attention to animal life, again, perhaps reinforces an exploitative or instrumental approach to animals and nature in general. And I would think of this as 4 key questions that help us decide when we think killing wildlife is okay from a welfare perspective. The first is, are we bothered about quality or quantity? And they're often seen as alternatives, but I think if we think of the value of life as being dependent upon its quality, then we can combine them. And actually the value of extended life depends on its quality, positive or negative. We can think about whether we're assessing individual animals or across the community, and is that about the benefits to each animal, or is there some emergent benefit? And again, quantity isn't always better. Being broilers or salmon might mean there are lots of those progeny and their genes around, but that doesn't mean they are having a good, thriving, flourishing existence from a welfare perspective. Thirdly, whose benefits? Are we asking questions about the animals' interests as individuals or as collectives? Or are we thinking about, actually, this is stuff for human benefit, and we're just trying to work out the welfare challenges to make sure it's not too egregious a form of exploitation or abuse? And finally, who's making the decision? Is it me as an individual? Am I representing humanity and trying to mitigate some of the harms that we're causing as a species? Because they would affect whether we make the decision to kill an animal, or actually that's not our responsibility. So thinking a bit now on when. Well, when would you say you have a wild life worth living? And that all depends on whether the chance of life is better than death. And that's about probabilities, but it's also about our human knowledge. And I do wonder whether we can talk about having species having a life worth living. Again, thinking back to broilers or some wild species. And of course, that opens questions of how enjoyable is wildlife. Is it balanced between the two? Or is it overall enjoyable? Or is it actually a life of suffering? Which, again, partly might depend on stage and circumstance. I think within our decision making, often we think about the significance of death relative to natural contexts. And this, I think, is really interesting philosophically. On the one hand, should we be comparing how we would kill animals to natural death processes, which are often quite unpleasant, at least in the short term for predation, but potentially longer term for starvation and disease? Or actually, is it because animals are in our care that becomes an irrelevant comparison? It's that actually, we have a responsibility to make that dying process as pain-free and as little as unpleasant as possible. By the same token, often we hear comparisons to natural mortality, because you get very high mortality rates in wild animals, especially often depending on the reproductive strategy and the phase of life. And again, I think there maybe can be some useful comparisons there if we are literally doing it for the animal's interests and comparing that. But often you find that those mortality rates might occur at an early stage in life, but not once you get, say, to adult marine fish ages, compared to some of the mortality rates that get reported in the literature for captive animals. And then finally, to what extent should we be comparing the quality of life that we require animals to be able to have in our care versus, again, natural quality of life, which, as we say, involves often some non-fatal suffering? And I think this is particularly interesting, mainly because what I think you don't see in the same way in nature is some of that super chronic suffering of animals in ways that are suffering enough that it would potentially be fatal or them unable to fulfill their needs, but are maintained within human contexts, be that as captive wildlife or as domestic animals. And so at least I think that creates a duty for us to ensure we're avoiding animals having that, beyond natural levels of chronic suffering. And finally, I think there's a good moral argument. If we're claiming we are better than nature, and that's why humans are superior to the rest of animal kind, well, then we need to make sure we actually fulfill that. And that is itself not about us being clever or cultured. That's about us being morally better in our interactions with each other and other animals. That's all I have time for. Thank you very much. Very happy to take questions and to discuss some of these interesting topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. We'll be invite you to join the panel when we reconvene after these next two talks. We're now going to invite Chris Cagienard to talk about pest professionals working in good animal welfare, and him being president of the British Pest Control Association puts him in an ideal position to do that. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, conference. It's my privilege to be able to join you today as one of the speakers. My name is Chris Cagienard and I'm a pest professional. Today I would like to speak to you about the lengths that professional pest controllers go to strive for the best possible animal welfare outcomes as they work hard to protect public health. By way of an introduction to myself and a little bit of background, I'm the Managing Director of a UK pest control company called Pest Solutions. I also serve currently as the President of the British Pest Control Association, the premier trade association representing urban pest control in the UK. I'm also a trained field biologist and a BPCA Master Technician. I've been in the industry for 25 years and I've seen a lot of change and a lot of good progress in that time. Let's dive in. With the limited time that we have today, I'd like to touch on a couple of topics. Briefly, I'd like to look at the need for professional pest control and its requirement to protect public health. I'd like to look at some potential misconceptions and stereotypes about professional pest controllers and the industry at large. I'd like to look at the challenges faced by pest professionals as they go about their work and the priorities they make in order to achieve effective pest management. Let's explore the alternatives. Are they viable? What impact do they have on animal welfare? And let's look at the future. How can we work together to achieve better outcomes for animal welfare in professional pest control? The need for effective pest management is obvious. We absolutely must protect public health. Pictures like this one are obvious too. Littering is our public shame. And this is the sort of challenge that we face in almost all of our UK towns and cities today. It is our public shame. It makes pest control harder. It gives pests more opportunities to thrive and population numbers to increase, but it does not take away the need for effective pest management. We must protect public health. That is a challenge that we face every day. Who are the pest professionals out there protecting public health? I think, according to stereotypes and misconceptions, that they're not who people think they are. Pest control can often be seen as a low-skilled job. It can often be seen as a profession where people don't care about animal welfare. That couldn't be further from the truth. Pest professionals are highly trained, highly skilled individuals. They work incredibly hard to ensure good animal welfare outcomes and make sure that they have limited impact on the environment whilst working hard to protect public health. They have a high regard for the responsibility that comes with the role. The reality is that at times we have to kill live animals. And when you have to do that, you need to make sure that if it needs done, if you're the person that's doing it, you take the responsibility to do it well. That's so important. And our pest professionals step up to that responsibility every day. The work of a professional pest controller to overcome these challenges starts far from lethal control. Education, prevention, informing customers, informing society of change that they can make in order to not attract pests in the first place is always better. It's much better for us if we don't need to control pests because they didn't exist in the first place. This can involve things like what you see here, of even going on the news to tell people about how they should store their rubbish and how they should not litter. However, unfortunately at times education and prevention can fail. In these situations, in order to protect public health, it is essential to administer lethal control to remove the risk. At this time, the pest professional should use their training and their skills to choose the right tool from their toolkit to achieve the required result with a minimum impact on animal welfare. And this is not always the same tool that they would choose in every situation. An example of this would be glue boards, a controversial topic which I'd like to preface with the fact that the BPCA and the pest professional industry in the UK, and myself personally, support a full ban on glue boards for public use. If you do not know how to use the tool, and if you're not trained how to use the tool, you should not use it. Cruelty is inexcusable. But glue boards, when used correctly in accordance with the PMA's Code of Best Conduct, can be administered in a humane way. A way that at times can be more humane than using large numbers of traps due to the prevalence of foul catches at scale when trapping. It's important to use the right tool, but it's also important to have an honest conversation about the welfare impacts of different control measures in different settings. As I just mentioned, when a professional pest controller considers administering lethal control, there are some priorities that they need to consider. They need to consider the risk to public health. We have to control public health. They must consider the impact on animal welfare. There's no excuse for cruelty. The reality is we are, at times, culling an animal, but we need to make sure we have the minimum impact and we are as humane in our practices as possible. We must also, when using products that are harmful or potentially harmful in the environment, that we use them wisely, that we are good stewards of the environment, and that we recover the products that are harmful after the work that we've done. We need to protect non-target species. Rather than me telling you my views, I invited some of our professional pest controllers to make their comments about what's important to them. I'll hand over to a couple of our pest professionals now.
I'm Chloe. I'm a graduate advanced technician at Pest Solutions, and I believe it's vital that we lead with humane practices within our industry. One of the most important parts of my job is to educate our customers on good proofing and good hygiene and housekeeping standards in order to reduce the need for lethal control.
I think the number one thing we can do to reduce the need for lethal controls is to work with our clients, whether they be residential or commercial, to improve the proofing of their buildings, to improve their hygiene practices and housekeeping, and reduce the need for lethal controls overall.
As a pest professional, I have a duty of care to the animals that I'm trying to control. As a professional, I care deeply about good trap placement. Traps should be assessed and placed to minimise risk of foul catch of the rodents. It concerns me that there are some traps out there available to untrained members of the public, and this could lead to poor welfare outcomes.
Understanding the resistance status of the rodents which we're trying to control is very important for animal welfare. If we understand which chemicals are ineffective, and more importantly which chemicals are effective, it allows us to select the correct tool for the job in the first instance, and that reduces the amount of lethal control that is needed.
As a pest control professional, I think it's very important we show respect for the animals we are dealing with, as well as the environment where they are living in. That's why we follow the campaign for responsible rodenticide use, where the main aim is to avoid primary and secondary poisoning of non-target species.
I hope that you found those views expressed by some of our frontline pest controllers helpful. They truly are passionate about protecting public health. They care deeply about animal welfare, and they really care about the impact that they have on the environment. They're passionate, caring individuals, and they are pest professionals. So what are the alternatives? Could we coexist with pests such as rats in our towns and cities? I just don't think that that's possible. The risk to public health is just too high. What are the alternatives to maintaining the toolkit of a pest professional? Well, pest control will get harder, it will get more expensive, it will become more time consuming. Problems will exist for longer. It will drive up the cost, and that will drive pest control underground into the hands of untrained individuals. And that gives me incredible fear of what the impact on animal welfare could be from that. We need to keep the tools in the hands of the professionals. Larger populations of pests becoming established will mean that there will have to be larger intervention to control them, because the risk to public health will be unacceptable. Professional pest control is essential in order to make sure that their impact to animal welfare is minimal. So what does the future hold? Well, we need to keep educating people. We need to be data driven. We need to allow the science to tell us what the best practices of the future are. We need to communicate with individuals like many of the people that are on this call today. We need to work together. We need to talk. We need to make sure we discuss these things. The British Pest Control Association has an academic relations working group. The view of that group is to work with researchers, to work with institutions that are doing valuable work on things like animal welfare. We want to work with you. We want to give you access to our frontline people so that we can get real actionable data and improvement on how we work. If you're interested in working with us, we'd love to work with you. Just a reminder of what the priorities for a pest professional are. These three things need to work together because we need to be effective in what we do. If we're ineffective, the impact on animal welfare will only increase. One can't go without the other. We need all three to work together. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen today, and in the panel discussion I invite any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris. I hope you can hear me. For some reason, my screen's not showing it as being broadcast. We're now moving on to the very last talk in this session by Jeremy Wilson, who's Director of Science in the RSPB. Unfortunately, Jeremy won't be joining us in the panel discussion today, but I'm confident this is going to be a fascinating talk. So thank you very much, Steve.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeremy Wilson. I'm Director of Science at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and I'm delighted to have been invited to speak to you about the RSPB's experience of wild animal welfare assessment in support of our conservation work. In the next few minutes, I'll explain briefly why RSPB undertakes wild animal welfare assessments, how we govern these, and along the way give a few examples of current conservation challenges informed by these assessments. First of all, we have a principle set by RSPB's Council of Trustees and which underpins all of our work that the RSPB needs to undertake to ensure that our mission to conserve nature is met with full regard to animal welfare. This entails being as compassionate to individual animals as possible and ensuring that our staff and our volunteers don't cause undue suffering either through their actions or from deliberate avoidance of action. The conservation work that needs to meet this principle falls broadly into two categories, though with some overlap. Firstly, RSPB is committed to being an evidence-based conservation organisation and hosts a conservation science team, that's the team that I'm proud to lead, that informs our policy and practice. And secondly, RSPB manages a network of over 200 nature reserves and engages in a wide range of conservation projects within and outside these reserves, both in the UK and internationally. So across both these spheres of activity, conservation science and conservation management, we strive to meet the Council principle. To help us do this, we have one underpinning Council-approved policy and a governance committee that each play central roles. Our policy on the killing of or taking of vertebrates and its associated codes of practice is founded on four key criteria, which I've summarised on the left of the slide. Firstly, that the activity must be legal. Secondly, that it must be ethically acceptable. Thirdly, that it must be scientifically justified. And fourthly, that it must be effective in delivering the conservation outcomes for which it was designed. And these criteria in turn reflect an underlying philosophy that we see interventions involving killing vertebrates or significant other welfare harms as a matter of last resort that require clear-cut justification, and we should not see them as routine business-as-usual management tools. So allied to this, our Ethics Advisory Committee, whose role is summarised on the right-hand side of the slide, advises on all activities causing welfare harms and also periodically on the vertebrate control policy and its codes of practice. The only exception is that for standard capture and marking procedures for birds, we do use the British Trust for Ornithology's licensing and oversight mechanisms as the main basis on which we maintain our technical and ethical standards. However, even here, if proposals emerged involving novel marking methods for birds, for example, we would certainly seek Ethics Advisory Committee advice. So here I've summarised the role that our Ethics Advisory Committee plays in scrutinising a wide range of proposed scientific interventions. So these are the grey boxes, including capture and handling of any vertebrates other than birds, any invasive procedures that require licensing under the Animal Scientific Procedures Act, and other indirect interventions. In all of these cases, the advice of the committee influences decisions on whether and how to undertake specific scientific interventions that have ethical implications, and thus helps to uphold the Council's principle. And just as an example of the other interventions category, we had a recent proposal to experimentally start or stop supplementary feeding in gardens to help us understand the drivers of spread of trichomonas infection in finches, notably greenfinches and chaffinches, and those proposals were examined by the committee. And here's a very current example. As you may know, highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI, has had very severe impacts on the breeding populations of many of our colonially breeding seabirds in the last few years, including species for which the UK hosts very high proportions of the global population, including the great skua here on the left and the northern gannet on the right. RSPB scientists are now supporting university-led research to better understand evolution and transmission of avian flu within and between species and sites, and proposals to take blood samples and cloacal swabs from gannets and kittiwakes are currently with our Ethics Advisory Committee. Sampling of gannets promises to be especially informative because of the recent remarkable discovery that dark eye pigmentation, and you can see this in the right eye of the bird in the right-hand image, is a marker of birds which have contracted but then survived avian flu infection. Moving to conservation management, the same logic applies, and here you can see the role of the Ethics Advisory Committee both in periodic advice on our vertebrate control policy and its codes of practice, but also advising on novel interventions for which we may have no code of practice, and I'll come to an example of this in a minute. and also again advising on other more indirect interventions that may not necessarily involve the killing or taking of animals. As an example of this, the use of lasers as bird deterrents would be reviewed by the Ethics Advisory Committee were an instance of this to be proposed. So here is an example where the Ethics Advisory Committee was recently involved, in this case to advise on this RSPB-led European Union life-funded partnership project on Rathlin Island in Northern Ireland. And a large part of this island is a special protection area for its breeding seabirds and an RSPB reserve. And the proposal here was to remove invasive brown rats and ferrets from the island in the interests of the long-term recovery of seabird populations. In this case, the intervention for rats was covered by an existing code of practice, but the removal of ferrets by trapping was not, and hence a specific application was considered by the Ethics Advisory Committee. And at the same time, the committee also examined risks associated with the removal operation for domestic and feral cats, and also scrutinised the evaluation protocols that will measure the impact on subsequent seabird recovery. I hope this brief presentation has given you a useful insight into our approach to wild animal welfare assessment to inform and guide our conservation work, and especially the critical role of our Ethics Advisory Committee. The committee is made up of 3 external experts providing advice and 4 internal members who take responsibility for decision-making arising from committee discussions. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all members of the committee since its inception in 2015, and especially to thank Alick Simmons, Dorothy McKeegan and Troy Gibson as our current external committee members. Their advice is generously and freely given, is utterly invaluable, and is essential in helping staff and volunteers both meet the ethical standards expected by our council and indeed to continue to work to improve those standards over the longer term. Thank you for listening. I must apologise that I'm unable to be with you today for the discussion session to follow, but I'd be delighted to answer any questions you may have, and that could be either via Alick's collation of questions, I'm sure he'll pass them on to me, or please do contact me directly at the email address given here. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, well, we just finished the last of these 6 talks this afternoon. Each of them have been different, but also variations on a theme. We now have 18 minutes for a number of questions, which I intend to put to members of the panel, which will be everybody understand, other than Jeremy, as we know, can't make it. There's some really quite interesting questions that have popped up here. I'm going to start off with one, if I can find it. You bear with me just a moment. That I particularly thought was probably worth aiming at. One moment, please. What is, ethically speaking, the difference between killing abundant herbivores by shooting or by bringing in predators? Both cases, we are the ultimate cause. I think probably I'm going to direct that initially at Adam, but I'm very keen to have other people come into this one. Bear in mind that I'm not going to expect this to dominate the entire discussion we've got this afternoon, but I thought it was a useful one to get you warmed up. So Adam.
Thank you, Alick. I was hoping you'd fire this one at James to start off with.
Well, you can have a go in a minute.
No, well, it is quite a difficult one. Again, in terms of, are we looking at why we're controlling these animals in isolation, or are we looking at wider objectives? And if we have a wider objective of improving biodiversity gain and habitat restoration, then predators may make a better intervention than just shooting, because they're part of the ecosystem. In the UK, vast majority of large predators have been removed over the past thousands of years, And so possibly bringing them back may help to control the animals like deer, which we know have issues for other elements of biodiversity. But it really, this is the issue with ethics, isn't it? It really comes back from your personal standpoint, and your personal standpoint is very much driven by what you believe in terms of, yeah, how you protect animals. But I'll let somebody else chip in now.
Yeah, I think Nick seems to want to jump in, and then I'm going to invite James.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting one, and I agree with what Adam said. I think it's, you know, it depends whether you want to take a sort of a natural processes approach. I think. I mean, you know, if you know, clearly both are going to create landscapes of fear. You know, we talk about landscapes of fear, and you know, and obviously, you know, deer stalking can create a landscape of fear just as a predator could. And you know, in terms of welfare, purely welfare, you know, a well-aimed shot is going to dispatch an animal much more, you know, likely much more quickly and more humanely than a predator might. But yeah, it comes down to objectives and I think natural processes and perhaps nature recovery and possibly also space, you know, the aerial space that we're talking about, you know, in this sort of situation.
Thank you, James.
Thank you. As people go past, I was hoping we'd at least cover that. That's been helpful. As well, yeah, so obviously on that, there's considerations of the method and the effectiveness. I think for the question of what makes a difference, I think one perhaps is that if you're reintroducing or re-establishing trophic levels, if you're creating those food webs, then that gives an opportunity over time for a new natural balance, and that might also be valuable for the integrity then of the ecosystem and its resilience, or maybe some of the carbon sequestration and those aspects, as well as for the welfare of the animals as they reach that balance. So I think that gives that opportunity that feels different in continued sustained human intervention. And again, to have that population level, it generally needs to be sustained. I think the other thing that maybe would be different would be if we see it as restoring natural ecosystems that are repairing previous human harms. So if we've removed, as Adam said, those predators, well, actually re-establishing that actually feels different than continued intervention, especially if the continued shooting is because we've removed those predators. Otherwise, we've done one harm, and then to solve that, you then do another harm. You go down to the mesopredators and where, etc. So I think I think there are probably two aspects, and I try and avoid the idea on this that somehow human management in all our rational scientific glory is going to be better than what's potentially been established over millennia prior to our disruption, and insofar as we can recover and revert.
Just to throw another pebble into the pond here, I don't know how many of you have been aware of what seems to be a slightly growing movement, which is towards herbivorization, partly stimulated by Martha Nussbaum's most recent book, Justice for Animals, where, like one of the speakers earlier today said, we have altered the environment so much that in order to be able to preserve, protect, and ensure the well-being of animals, we need to intervene everywhere. The idea that some people are advocating is that we find a way through science, I'm not quite sure how this is going to happen, to train all animals to become herbivores. Now, clearly, we're a long, long way off that, because in fact, it strikes me as being, well, I've got to, given I'm a neutral chair, I want not to express my opinion on this, but it clearly is, I feel like a philosophical position that a number of people have adopted. So my view personally is, let's have the predators back, but it's also worth bearing in mind, if we're going to recognize there are a whole series of various different positions, one of them might be at the other extreme, which is we must prevent all predation of all animals in all circumstances. Even to the point where if we can't genetically engineer a lion to develop a set of 4 stomachs, then we find a way of painlessly killing them. which has been certainly been suggested by one or two philosophers. Quite weird stuff. Anyway, just a brief. Anybody want to respond to that other than the big guffaw?
I just think that is the ultimate in human control of nature and natural systems, isn't it? My goodness. Yeah, wow.
Yes, indeed. Quite, it's worth a read. Justice for Animals, Martha Nussbaum. James.
Yeah, and a big respect for and fan of her work. I think on this, and again, today we're focusing on, I think, practical questions that are in front of us, and we've got enough of those to try and get right. I think there's, and again, it depends where you are, but us as a species to be, trying to have that control would only be justified if we were absolutely certain we would get that right. And bearing in mind what we do to animals, there's that we can't be very optimistic about that ability. And again, collectively, especially as you would imagine it's the very attitudes, the very people, the very systems, the very governance that are causing lots of those problems that somehow would be involved in whatever sort of utopian idea we might be considering. So whether or not there's a potential moral value in doing that when it's possible, things are only morally right when they're possible, but also I think we would have to be really concerned about our ability actually to see that through. And of course, we're arguably a species that doesn't need to eat, be predators to the, certainly not to the extent many are. So again, we've got our own challenges, I think, to get through in the same way as, let's address our impacts on ecosystems and indigenous.
I'm going to change the subject a little bit now. Thank you, James. And I'm going to direct the question initially to Chris and then subsequently to Julie, but have an opportunity for the rest of you to chime if you want. It's a slight paraphrasing of a question that's been answered. It doesn't seem to say who from. Could better public awareness about animal welfare lead to more effective and humane pest control? And what is driving the public to take on do-it-yourself actions? So, Chris, what do you think about that?
100%. I do know that being a representative of the UK professional pest control industry, or the pest control industry in general, is a sensitive one in this type of forum, because the word pest itself can be considered demonising these animals, and it's true, it's correct. Unfortunately, as a representative of the professional pest control industry, this is what we call ourselves. But it's absolutely the first thing that a professional would do is consider whether something is a pest at all. And not all animals are pests in all situations. And a large part of our work is educating people. And this idea of demonising animals by referring to them as pests, often the fairest thing is not demonising the animal, but demonising the behaviour of us humans. Most issues where animals become pests, it's our behaviour that makes it so. It's us. The littering thing is a massive thing in the UK. Our behaviours at times are shameful. Our behaviours attract animals to enter into areas where they shouldn't necessarily be. And I think we have to take a massive responsibility for that. So a significant part of our work is educating people, but we can't do it by ourselves. We need a larger, more joined up piece of work to help enforce responsible behaviours, because the fact that we're even needed in the first place is often a shame. When we're needed, we need to protect public health, but often changing behaviours of the public, making people more responsible for their conduct would really help.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Julie to come in on that, but also afterwards, perhaps you could talk a little bit about what work is being done about exclusion of rodents in particular from houses, restaurants, pubs and so forth. So invite Julie just to talk a little bit about how best to try and reduce the need for pest control in the same way that Chris has been talking about, but in particular, how we can improve on the exclusion. I'm not in a good position here. I have a 400-year-old house where I should think probably anything can get in, up to about the size of a badger. So, but I know that modern houses are much better. But is this practically possible?
Yeah, I mean, we've done quite a bit of work on farms. We haven't done domestic houses, but I think, you know, like you say, we've just bought a brand new house, which we've never been in before, and literally had mice in it within the first week, and they'd left one of the pipes open at the back. But yeah, I think certainly just having weeds. I mean, what we did the work on the farms, just advising farmers on, you know, weed control, particularly, you know, not just on the farm but on the edges. You know, if you provide, if it's high weeds, high nettles, it's got somewhere for rats and things to go. But also badgers having access to cattle. You know, there's we've done lots of work, sort of silly things like, you know, electric fences, and then there's bags of feed across the fence, so there's a passageway for the badgers to get through. So I think with all respect of animal welfare, education is so important. And I think apart from educating people on how to reduce ingress of pests, is educating them about the methods that they're using to get rid of them. You know, and like Chris says, I think, you know, that having proper pest controllers is really important. And from a welfare point of view, any kind of, I think, welfare interaction, having good training and knowing what you're doing is so important, makes a massive difference. But educating people about rodenticides and, you know, don't go throwing them around, you know, there are better ways of doing this in your own house, is really important, I think. So, but yeah, I think we reduced, it was quite work we did a long time ago, Alick, and but I think we reduced rat populations on 10 farms by over 60% by literally just tidying them up. So yeah, it's and also it's from a farmer's point of view or a person's point of view, it's also more economic, more hygienic. It's not just from an animal welfare point of view, is it? If you can do that. So yeah, I think there's a lot about education. And like Chris was saying, you know, a pest is just an animal in the wrong place, isn't it? So there's not a pest species, it's just an animal that happens to be in the wrong place. So
can I be really cheeky and come back in on that? Yeah, educating people about why we educate people about non-target species. We sort of start from the other side. So because the name of our industry is the pest control industry, we do most of our work educating people as to why animals are not pests, rather than not using the term in the first place. But education's massive, it's the biggest thing. And for us, it doesn't just start with the customer, it starts with increasing the standard of education and training and skills of a pest controller. But the industry's come so far in the 25 years I've been in the industry, but the chief skill, the best skill, the most significant skill for a pest controller that can help with animal welfare is negotiation skills, because we need to convince people to do the things that prevent pests or animals being pests. And that starts with getting somebody to listen to our advice about proofing buildings, about excluding animals from gaining ingress. And often we're competing against lots of other priorities. You know, people have got staffing concerns, they've got supply chain concerns, and our part of their world is very small. So negotiation skills, which are far from lethal control, obviously, are the most significant thing. If we can get people to listen to our advice, we can shortcut the need for any sort of lethal control.
Okay.
Can I just mention one other thing, Alex? Sorry, before we move on.
Very briefly, because I want to bring in one more question before we close.
I was just wondering as well, with respect to education, is just educating people about the actual animals themselves, because you give a rat a bushy tail, it becomes a squirrel and everybody loves it. So I think there's a bit there about iconography, is that how you say it? But yeah, anyway, I'll let you move on.
Good point. Well, actually, this is I feel like a development of what we've just been discussing about. There's an interesting question here from somebody, I think, who's resident in Hong Kong, talking about the common wolf snake as being identified as an introduced species. And it looks like there's going to be some intervention against them. And the question he has to ask as a wildlife veterinarian is, where does he have to ethically stand if I'm told I have to euthanize every snake that he's presented with? Presumably, this is not so very different from the grey squirrel that people either catch deliberately or accidentally in the UK, where the law requires you to not to release them. Where does that put us, given that I'm assuming that the majority of you, in fact, probably all of you, I hope, would rather see native animals be in the ascendancy and the non-native invasive species be reduced or eliminated? Who can I start with? Nick.
Yeah, just a quick one. There's a recent paper, and I can put the link in the in the chat, perhaps, published recently, that actually, if you're in the nature conservation camp, that actually non-native invasive species are one of the major drivers globally around nature decline. So that's not an ethical or humane kind of argument to this, but actually it's one way of looking at this, you know, major issue around nature decline.
Okay, but where would you say, would you have an all-out battle to get rid of these on a huge island? Now, gone huge island, but on the UK, to get rid of the grey squirrel, the Canada goose, the muntjac, given that it's very likely that in order to get rid of them, some of the methods might actually not be particularly welfare friendly.
It's an interesting question. I mean, one of the considerations we have, especially in Scotland, is conservation of red squirrels, and obviously as part of that we have to control grey squirrels to a degree. I was really interested in this idea of contraceptive. I just wondered if that would affect red squirrels, if you could have it so that it affected one and not the other. I don't think that's likely to be possible, but yeah, really interesting. I'd love to hear more about that, because there's work there needing done to protect the red squirrel population, because it is really under threat.
And Alick, we're already doing this on some of our small islands, aren't we? We're already eradicating things on some of our small islands, and we're having similar conversations on some of our places around things like Chinese water deer, you know, where they're becoming so non-native, becoming a real concern, you know, growing evidence around predation of ground nesting birds' eggs, as with muntjac. So yeah, but we're already doing this on some of our small islands, aren't we?
If I jump in, Alick, so this is where we come back to the consensus principles, because if you have an objective of trying to eradicate the grey squirrel from Great Britain, you are probably not going to achieve it. But you might be able to look at something like Anglesey and say, yes, that's an achievable goal, is to remove grey squirrels from Anglesey and keep them off Anglesey in order to retain the red squirrel population. And I think that's why you need a clear objective. I think I remember sitting in enough on a workshop was discussing gene drive for grey squirrels. And a lot of the foresters were saying that even the shooting they do doesn't work, because you come back to this whole landscape policy, which we talked about with the deer. If you don't have clear objectives and the landscape scale policies, most of these small scale culls don't work, because the animals will just come back in. I appreciate what Chris said. If you can educate people, improve, say, their hygiene habits to reduce the chances of animals coming in from the rat point of view. But for things like squirrels that live wild in the countryside, you know, I think you need very good, clear, systematic objectives, and then work to those objectives. Don't just think we need to kill all the squirrels.
I think so. Sorry, was it okay to come in? Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, James. Yeah, I think the main thing, Adam, as well, because I've got a vested interest here, because the non-native inspectorate sits in my team, but it's about invasiveness, isn't it? So what you want to do is not control non-natives, but control them where they're having the most impact. And so with grey squirrels, what you want to look at is getting them down to a population where the tree damage, I know red squirrels is more publicly nice, but the main issue with greys is the tree damage. So it's not non-nativeness, it's invasiveness, I think. But and getting the population down could still have a massive impact on biodiversity, even if we can't eradicate. Sorry, I'll shut up now.
Well, I think it's a good point, but I think Adam's point about, if you like, if the stated aim, which might be, say, elimination of grey squirrels from Great Britain, is technically and logistically and financially unachievable, it would be unethical to start, if that were your stated objective. If, for example, within a relatively smaller area, you were seeking to allow trees to get established, and therefore you were going to kill them out over a period of 6 months or 6 years, then that might be ethically acceptable. But the idea that you're going to apply a set of interventions which almost certainly are not going to be successful, it doesn't sound like a good thing to do.
Yeah, well, it depends how you measure success, doesn't it?
Well, exactly, and this is where a lot of the things come into. I won't get into bovine TB for that very reason. The final question, because I think there's a really interesting one here, and again, it's aimed at Nick, but it's going to be probably for all of you to chime in if you think it's appropriate. In your experience of applying the principles, which principle leads to the most rethinking of management?
Gosh. I think monitoring of efficacy, actually, you know, I think that's for us, that's a real challenge. We're really looking at environmental monitoring in the round, and actually in a big institution, that's quite a challenge, and wildlife management part of that. I think we're having those good conversations locally, but I think corralling that nationally around is what we're doing, having the effect that we want to do. I think that's probably the most challenging principle for us.
Okay. Anybody else like to add anything?
I'd say the most challenging principle is changing human behavior, because it's just our attitudes to animals are so ingrained by culture and so on, and you're having to change many years of cultural understanding, or cultural beliefs, perhaps is the wrong word, or cultural knowledge about these animals. It's where we come back to the whole conversation about, is this animal a pest or not? We have so many years of being told through stories and so on about why rats are bad or why foxes are bad, and that just gets into the cultural psyche, and then you're trying to basically then educate people to say, actually no, you shouldn't look at those animals like that. And this is where it comes back to storytelling. Are there ways of telling stories to put these animals in a different light, to basically show there are other ways, or they are sentient, you know? And I can never understand how some people can look at a fox, and a fox being the classic example with hunting, about how it gets these nicknames and it gets this reputation for being an animal that is so cunning and devious. But they also, so therefore, must give it ideas of sentience, obviously, but then think it's not going to suffer, or why is it going to suffer in the hunt? That's sort of things I understood, but it's very much a cultural education. I think changing that is the biggest obstacle in terms of the principles.
And when you look at how those cultural values vary around the world, it becomes even more of a problem, because you have a spectrum of values within the UK, for example, but they're very different from in many of the other countries in which I've worked, and I'm sure many of you will have similar problems or similar experience. I think we just got a wee message saying we need to finish, and that's exactly what I was about to do. I want to first of all thank you all very much for your very, very well prepared and thoughtful talks, but also for your interventions and help this afternoon in the discussion. There's a great deal of food for thought there. There's an awful lot of questions which we haven't managed to get to. I've tried to get a reasonable representative sample of them, but I'm sure I haven't done justice. For those of you who haven't had an opportunity to have their questions addressed, then I apologise, but inevitably we are running to a tight schedule. And that means that we're going to stop now until, I believe, 4:20, when we'll go into the final session of the day. Once again, thank you all very much, and I hope to see some of you next few weeks or next few days. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alick.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.